Left to die among monsters, the little alien girl screamed. Then a human shadow fell over her. The scream came up out of the slender in a shape Daniel Reyes had not heard in 3 years and had hoped never to hear again. He knew animal screams. He knew the noise a crest deer made when a wire lynx opened its throat. Knew the rising whistle of a pond cat cornered against its own nest. Knew the low coughing bark of a bastard when it lost a fight with its own brother. This was not an animal. This was a child. He set the maul against the chopping block and stood still. For a full second, the forest around his cabin did nothing. No birds, no wind in the rust-colored canopy. Only the ringing in his ears that never quite went away and the slow cold settling under his sternum that he had spent 3 years trying to unlearn. The scream came again, thinner, further down the slope, and something about the second note told him the thing screaming was about to stop. He went in through the back door, took the CM14 carbine off the wall peg, where it had hung so long the paint had ghosted its shape onto the wood, and checked the charge without looking. Full. It was always full. He had been a bad liar about why for 3 years. At 34, he still moved like a man who expected the ground to kick him, low and loose in the shoulders, picking his line down the slope through the bracken with an economy his knees remembered better than he did. His hair was going at the temples. The scar through his left eyebrow had turned the color of old paper. His gray eyes did what they had done in the line, which was to stop being eyes and start being a pair of sensors. He was running before he knew he had decided to run. The slender was the ravine that cut under his ridge and fed into the rusted shoulders of the Ironwood Basin. In spring it ran with green water. In late autumn it ran with nothing, just a dry stone seam through the forest floor that the old hunters used as a path because the thornberry did not grow in it. He followed that seam now, carbine up, breath coming short, not because the grade was steep, but because his body had remembered things about itself that he had told it to forget. He heard the whistle before he saw the clearing, a rising 3-note signal, metallic and clean, nothing a living thing would make. He went to his knees behind a fallen ironwood and put his scope on the bowl of ground ahead of him, and the cold behind his sternum climbed up into his teeth. A woman lay on her side in the leaf litter, a torn cloth cloak pulled half across her face, mossy green skin, one hand still half outstretched, fingers curled, 3 fingers on that hand and not 4. Behind her, backed up against a mossy root ball, a small shape in a woven tunic, white braids, both hands flat against the bark of the tree. A child, green skin, darker at the knuckles and throat, a smear of violet blood on her shoulder. Around her, 3 shapes moving in the way predators moved. Daniel had seen wolves. These were not wolves. The articulation at the knees was wrong. The head was too flat, and the eyes were not eyes, they were lenses, small and round and black, set into a plate of matte steel behind a false muzzle that was meant to look like an apex scavenger to someone passing in a hurry. He had read the classification sheet on them once, when he was in a briefing room he was not supposed to be in, and he had not forgotten the name. Shrikes, quadrupedal hunter drones, deployed by the Iron Compact on worlds where evidence was not to be left behind. 3 of them. A child of about 6 human years was holding herself perfectly still against a tree 40 meters from his scope, and the nearest shrike was settling onto its haunches the way they did before they lunged. The girl screamed again. Daniel shot the nearest shrike through the thoracic plate. The round went in clean, and the drone's forelegs simply stopped being part of the drone, and the thing that had been the drone threw itself sideways in a spray of coolant. The second unit pivoted into the sound, and Daniel let the carbine ride the recoil into its throat, and the throat came apart, and the thing went down hissing steam. The third shrike started a flanking pattern he had seen too many times in too many dark places. He knew where it was going before it did. He shot it in the hinge of its left foreleg as it crossed the clearing, and when it stumbled, he put 2 more rounds into the cavity behind its jaw. It folded into the leaves and did not get up. Silence came down on the clearing in the way silence came down after this kind of work, which was never quite silence. Something ticked somewhere. A coolant line hissed. He held the carbine up for 5 long breaths and swept the tree line and found nothing else alive that meant him harm. Only then did he let himself look at the girl. She had stopped screaming. She had not stopped shaking. Her amber eyes were enormous, and they were fixed on him the way small animals fix on a thing whose category they do not yet understand. Her woven tunic was torn along the hem. One of the white braids had come undone and hung in a frayed rope across her collarbone. Around her thin wrist, a bracelet of dyed reed fibers, dark red, tied in a knot he did not know the name of. He lowered the carbine. He put his hands where she could see them. "Hey," he said very softly, and his own voice surprised him because he had not used it in a week. "Hey, it's all right." She did not move. He walked to her the way he had once walked to children in the transit camps, flat-footed, hands visible, eyes lowered enough that he was not looming. Her eyes never left his face. When he was close enough, he knelt in the leaves so that he was shorter than she was, and he waited. She looked past him, once, at the woman on the ground, and the sound she made then was the worst sound he had heard in a long time. It was not a scream. It was the small, compressed noise a throat makes when a child has been taught that grief is a thing other people get killed for. He reached very slowly, and he put his hand on the ground between them, palm up, and he kept it there. He did not know what to say. He was not good at saying things. He was reaching for the first honest thing that came up in him, and what came up was not a sentence he had planned. He looked at the woman under the cloak. He looked at the woman's hand, still reaching. He looked at the child. "Your mother is beautiful," he said. The child blinked. He did not know if she understood the words. He did not think she did. He thought that maybe the sound of the sentence, more than the meaning, had told her something about the man kneeling in front of her, because after a long, still moment she stepped away from the tree, and she walked on her small, bare feet into the space he had opened between them, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and she did not cry, and the not crying was what finally broke him. He picked her up. She weighed less than she should have. She put her arms around his neck and she held on. Her blood was warm through his sleeve. His carbine hung off his other shoulder on its sling. He stood in the clearing with her for a long time. He looked down at the woman on the ground, and he said in his head, not out loud, that he was sorry he had not been faster. He said in his head that he would bring her daughter home, and that he would do it right this time. Then he walked out of the slender with the child, and the shadow the forest had sent him fell into step beside him, like it had always belonged there. The cabin sat on the north ridge above the slender, 2 rooms and a loft, built by a man who had died before Daniel had bought the deed. It was stone to the windowsills and timber above, and it kept the cold out in winter and the flies out in summer, and it had been until an hour ago the quietest place Daniel had ever lived. He came up the back trail with the child asleep against his shoulder and the evening sun throwing long copper bars through the canopy, and he set her down on the kitchen table because the kitchen table was the cleanest flat surface he owned. She woke when the wood touched her back. She did not thrash. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and understood where she was. In the way of a child who had already learned, at 6, that waking up somewhere strange was a thing her life was going to keep asking of her. He lit the lamp with his left hand because his right was busy unbuckling the medkit. The lamp was the bad one that flared before it settled. She flinched at the flare, and he said sorry before he thought about it, and something moved in her face at the word. She had understood that. That word she knew. He said it again. Sorry. She held up 2 fingers on her left hand. Not 3. 2. He did not know what it meant. He tucked the gesture away to think about later, which was what he had learned to do with facts he did not yet have a use for. The shoulder wound was not bad by his standards. A long grazing cut, maybe 8 centimeters, shallow but dirty. Shrike claws were sterile when they came off the factory line and filthy after a day in the forest, and he had to assume the latter. He laid out the kit on the table beside her, antiseptic wipe, bonding gel, suture thread, local anesthetic and a pen injector, and he watched her watch the layout, and he watched her understand. She had seen a medic's kit before. She did not like it. She did not run from it. I have to clean it, he said. He held up the wipe. He pointed at her shoulder. She nodded, one short, crisp nod, and she turned her face away from him toward the window. He worked the way he had been taught to work. Slow on the initial contact, faster through the middle, slow again at the close. He talked while he did it, not because he thought she understood, but because a patient oriented to a voice held still better. He told her about the cabin. He told her that the wood in the stove was yeoman pine and that it burned hotter than ironwood. He told her the cold season was coming in 3 weeks and that the first snow usually landed on the ridge before it landed in the basin. He told her that the light in the kitchen was bad because the lamp needed a new wick and he kept forgetting to order one. Her blood was darker than human blood, almost violet in the lamplight. The bonding gel took it up and held. He stitched through the deep layer because the cut had clipped the edge of the deltoid, and he did not want the muscle to pull the wound open in the night. She flinched once when the needle went through a stubborn bit of skin, and she did not cry. That was the thing that opened the cold space behind his sternum again. He had stitched a lot of children, and they had cried. This one was not crying, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had been in enough camps to stop being polite about it, that she was not crying because she had been taught that tears cost something. "You can cry," he said quietly. "It's all right. I'm not. I won't." Her eyes came back to his face. She did not understand the words. She understood the shape of them. She did not cry. She did not look away from him again either. He finished the stitch. He dressed it with the gel and a bandage strip. He put the med kit away. He filled the kettle from the water barrel and set it on the stove, and the smell of old iron and pine and hot water began to do to the cabin what it had always done to the cabin, which was to take a dead room and put a person back inside it. He pointed at himself. "Daniel," he said. She watched him. He pointed again. "Danielle." A long pause. She pointed at herself. Her voice, when it came, was like the wind he had stopped noticing in the trees, consonant light, breath-shaped, not a name he could hold in his throat. He tried it back. He got close, maybe. She smiled, just the corner of her mouth. She said it again, slower, and he heard it the second time, and held the shape and gave her back the closest he could manage, which was Kaelith. She tipped her head. She said it after him. It was not her name. It was what her name sounded like when a human throat went around it. She said it again, and she nodded once, like she was agreeing to a trade. And from that moment on, the child in his cabin was Kaelith. He fed her the softest thing in his pantry, which was a cup of broth with rehydrated grain and a little mashed tuber on the side. She ate with her 3 fingers, carefully, tiny bites, keeping her elbows close to her body. She did not spill a drop. When she was done, she set the spoon down exactly parallel to the edge of the bowl. He moved the one good chair near the stove and covered it with his spare blanket. She climbed into it on her own and folded her legs under her and watched him bank the fire. He sat on the floor with his back against the kitchen wall and the carbine across his knees, and he looked at the dark square of the window, and he listened to the forest do what the forest did at night. An hour in, her breathing evened out. 2 hours in, she was asleep, with the blanket slipping off her shoulder. He got up very quietly and he pulled the blanket back over her, and when his hand passed near her cheek, she made a soft sound in her sleep and leaned into his hand without waking. He took his hand away like he had touched something that did not belong to him. He did not sleep. Near dawn, he heard the thing he had been waiting to hear. It came in high above the ridge, running dark, the signature wrong for civilian craft, and it did not descend and it did not turn away. It went east along the spine of the basin, the way a man walks down a hallway looking for a room. He watched the ceiling and he listened to it go. When it was gone, he stayed where he was and he counted to 100, and then he counted to 100 again, and then he stood up because the kettle needed filling. At first light, Kaelith woke on her own. She sat up in the chair and pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at him across the room. He was at the stove pouring water. She watched him pour. He brought her a cup of warm water with a spoon of honey in it because he did not know what she could eat, and he knew that honey would not hurt her. She took it in both hands and drank it in small, slow sips. When she was done, she pointed at his left leg. He knew what she was pointing at. The trouser hung a little differently below the knee than above it. She had noticed because she was the kind of child who noticed. He pulled up the cuff and showed her the prosthetic, carbon and matte polymer, and the small service port on the side. She looked. She did not touch it. She did not ask. He let the cuff fall. He sat down on the floor in front of her chair, and he said, "We're all right for now." She did not understand the words. She put her small three-fingered hand on top of his, on the back of his wrist, and she held it there, and she did not let go for a long time. 3 days turned into 5, and 5 turned into something he stopped counting. She learned the cabin, she learned the kettle, the stove, the slant of light through the south window in late morning. She learned where the water barrel was and where the wood pile was and how to push the stove door closed with the toe of her bare foot. She learned the word please inside 2 days, and she used it like a key she had been given. Please water, please outside, please sit. Her voice when she spoke his language was still strange in her throat, but the words came out clean. And Daniel, who had taken 6 months of combat xenolinguistics the year before he mustered out, began to understand that Kaelith was not just very bright, she was very well taught. Someone had spent a lot of time on this child, in the worst possible conditions, and they had made her ready. She followed him when he chopped wood. She stood a careful 2 meters off, out of the arc of the mall, and she watched the motion, and she did not flinch at the impact. She followed him when he went to the water barrel, and she learned the word bucket. She followed him to the edge of the clearing and stopped at the tree line and did not go past it, because he had pointed at the trees one morning and shaken his head, and that was all she had needed. On the 4th day, he gave her a piece of scrap paper and a pencil stub. She held them in her lap for a long time, like a person who had been given a thing they were not sure they were allowed to use. Then she bent over the paper and she drew. She drew her mother. He almost had to leave the room. She drew her mother with the braids intact and the cloak whole, and the 3 fingers of the outstretched hand gently curled. She drew her mother's face without grief on it. He realized, watching her work, that she was not drawing what she had seen in the slender. She was drawing what she chose to remember. He had known some hard-eyed old soldiers who did not have that trick. She drew a ship next, a ship with a broken wing, tilted in tall grass, 3 small circles under it that might have been people or might have been shadows. She drew the forest around the ship in short, confident strokes, not child's forest, real forest, with the slant of ironwood branches right. Then she drew 3 shrikes. Her pencil stopped being soft. The lines came down harder. The drones in her drawing had too many legs and not enough, in the way the eye sees a nightmare. She drew the lenses as black discs. She drew a small figure behind the drones, tall, thin, holding a staff with something on its end that she had not given a shape to. Only the staff. Only the tall, thin silhouette. She looked at that figure for a long time, and then she put the pencil down and she slid off the chair, and she walked out of the kitchen, and she sat on the front step in the sun. Daniel stayed where he was. He picked up the drawing. He looked at the tall, thin figure, and he felt the cold under his sternum climb up again, and this time it stayed. He knew what that figure was. He had never seen one in the field, but he had sat through a briefing room screening of a warden once, in a secure compartment 2 levels under a moon he did not remember the name of, and the silhouette in Kaelith's drawing matched the silhouette on the screen. He had been told to forget what he had seen in that room. He had forgotten most of it. He had not forgotten that staff. He folded the drawing in half and put it on top of the stove where the heat would curl it, and he did not know why he did that. He took it down a minute later and smoothed it on the table and left it alone. That afternoon he told Kaelith he had to go back. She did not understand the words. He pointed at himself, then at the door, then at the downward slope toward the slender. He tapped his own shoulder and then shook his head. He pointed at her and then at the floor. She understood. She did not cry. She nodded, one clean nod, the same nod he had seen her give the needle. She looked at him with the kind of attention a child who has lost the top layer of her life gives to the second layer, and he almost did not go. He went. He went because he knew he was going to have to go again and go harder, and because the only way to know the shape of what he was about to do was to walk back to the clearing in the slender and put his eyes on what he had left behind. He took the carbine. He took a shovel folded against the pack. He took the long, matte black collapsible stretcher he had not used in 4 years and had never been able to bring himself to throw away. The clearing was quiet when he reached it. The 3 shrikes were still where he had dropped them. Coolant had leaked out of the nearest one and mixed with the leaf litter, and left a black stain the size of a dinner plate. He knelt by the drone, and he did what a man in his line had been trained to do, which was to pull the hinge plate and find the identifying marks. The serial stamp was where serial stamps lived. The model was the current year's Shrike chassis, updated rotators, the new targeting laminate at the rear of the skull. This was not stockpiled kit. This was field deployment from a current inventory. He found two things he did not like. The first was that the casings scattered across the clearing were his own, and they had been swept into a small, neat pile by somebody who was not him. Somebody had been here since he had left. They had stood over the Shrikes. They had picked up his casings so that no forensic package could catalog them. They had not touched the drones. They had not touched the woman. They had wanted him to know they had been there. The second was a burn mark in the dirt, 4 meters off, circular, the exact diameter of the footprint of a warden's mobile relay point. Someone in a very expensive pair of boots had stood there and had watched the clearing and had gone back up the ridge in his direction, and he had not heard them because he had not been listening for them. He worked slowly. He worked with his back to no sight line more than once. He dug a grave for the woman on a patch of high ground near a cedar tree whose roots would not disturb her. He lifted her onto the stretcher the way he had been trained to lift a person who had once been a whole life and who was now, whether anyone liked it or not, a thing to be lifted. He buried her with her cloak around her and with her hands composed across her chest, 3 fingers and 3 fingers. He marked the grave with a flat stone, and on the stone he scratched 2 straight lines crossed at the top, which was as close as he could get to a mother sign in any alphabet he knew. Under her body he found a data chit. She had been lying on it, not under her in the sense of having fallen on it, under her in the sense of having tucked it between her chest and the ground as she went down, because she had known what was coming and she had chosen what her last act would be. He put the chit in an inner pocket of his jacket, and he kept his hand on it all the way back up the ridge. At the cabin, he put the chit into his old field deck, the one he had stolen from his own kit the day he had mustered out, because he had known even then that he was not quite done. He had not used the deck in 2 years. The display threw up a rotating blue file header and asked for a passphrase and a fingerprint. And when he gave it neither of those, it went to a shallow layer of the chit he could still read. It was a refugee roster, partial, encrypted past the first layer. Verdani, 71 names, 6 worlds, 2 transit routes, and at the top of the list a field he almost did not see because he was looking for names and this was not a name. Verdant Voice, last known. 1. He sat in his kitchen looking at the line on the display for a long time. He did not know what Verdant Voice meant. He knew what last known one meant. He had written last known, one at the top of too many evacuation manifests on a world he had not said out loud in 3 years, and every time he had written it, he had been describing a thing that somebody with more money than mercy was about to come looking for. He walked out of the kitchen. He walked to the window that faced the ridge, and he stood there for a long time, and he looked at the tree line. A village in a valley 3 years ago had looked up at him as he came down off the drop. 71 faces. 71. The number in the chit was the same number, and he knew the brain did that. He knew the brain arranged coincidences out of grief, but the coincidence did not go away just because he knew what it was. He had not gotten to that village in time. He had walked into the square 3 hours after the work had been done, and he had counted the bodies by threes because that was how he had been taught to count bodies. And he had come out of that square a man who was going to live alone in a forest for the rest of his life. He had not heard Kaelith come up behind him. She put her small 3-fingered hand on the back of his wrist. She was standing just under his elbow. She said a word he did not know in her own language, and she did not try to translate it, and she looked up at him with the amber eyes that had watched the needle without crying. He knew what he was being asked. He put his hand over hers. He held it there. "All right," he said. "All right." He pulled up the floorboard under the kitchen table that night, and he opened the cache he had not opened since he had moved in. Spare cells for the carbine, a short-barreled breaching piece, 2 pouches of med-grade stimulants he had told himself he would throw out and had not, a set of long-range comms he had not been authorized to take with him when he left his unit, and which he had taken anyway. He checked the comms. He did not turn them on. He put everything on the kitchen table in neat rows. Kaelith came in and sat in her chair and watched him work. And he let her, because she had earned the right to see what was coming for her and to watch the man she had found putting it in order. 2 mornings later, the skim car came. He had been expecting it. He had counted the minimum response time a warden on Ashen Point would need to file a field assessment and deploy with a pair of standard enforcers, and he had given the minimum a generous buffer, and they came almost exactly when he had predicted them. The car crested the ridge at mid-morning. It was a gray field vehicle with no markings, running on repulsors, the dust turning to copper in the slant of the sun behind it. It landed on his gravel drive with the economy of a driver who had done this many times on many ridges. 3 figures stepped out. 2 of them were standard compact field enforcers, gray laminate armor, visor down, pulse rifles low across the chest at the ready one position, the position a man holds his rifle when he is not yet looking for a target, but is ready to find one in half a second. Daniel cataloged them the way he cataloged terrain. Left one was taller, moved stiff in the left hip, probably had a recent field injury. Right one was younger, his head moved too often, he was scanning because he had been told to scan, and not because he was good at it. Both were a problem. Neither was the problem. The problem stood between them. The warden was tall and thin and wore a field coat that was cut a little too long at the back because the spine under it was not a spine a human tailor would have known how to fit. His face, what there was of a face, was matte gray, with 2 narrow horizontal slits where eyes belonged and a small round aperture where a mouth should have been. Across his back was slung a staff the length of his body, a staff with a black disc at the top that looked like a closed eye. Daniel knew that staff. He had seen the silhouette before in a briefing room he was not supposed to have been in, and he had seen the shape of it in a child's drawing on his kitchen table 4 days ago. He went out onto the porch. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his face composed in the expression of a homesteader who hated visitors. He was good at that expression. He had been practicing it for 3 years. The carbine was inside the doorframe, within reach of his right hand. Kaelith was in the cellar under the iron stove. He had put her there himself that morning with a lamp and a blanket and the folded knife. She had not argued. She had understood what the cellar was. "Help you?" he said. The warden's head did not tilt. His voice, when it came, was processed through something that was not a throat. It was flat, pleasant, patient, a voice engineered to be bearable. "Mr. Reyes." "Yes. We are conducting a fauna survey of the Ironwood Basin. There have been reports of unusual predator activity in this sector. We are canvassing the homesteads within a 7-kilometer radius. 7 kilometers is a long canvass. It is a thorough one." Daniel shrugged. "I haven't seen anything." The warden's head turned, not tilted, turned. The slits that served him as eyes swept the front of the cabin in a slow arc, took in the porch and the windows and the stack of firewood under the eave, and came back to Daniel's face. Daniel kept his hands in his pockets. He kept his breathing even. He did not look at the cellar hatch, and he did not think about the cellar hatch, because he had learned in a certain kind of training that thinking about a thing could make a trained observer look at that thing. "You have been splitting wood," the warden said. "I have. A great deal of wood. Winter's coming." "It is." The warden's head turned again. The 2 enforcers had not moved. The stiff-hipped one had his weight very slightly forward. The young one had his weight very slightly back. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Reyes," the warden said. "You're welcome." The warden held his gaze another second, which was a second longer than a fauna survey needed, and then he turned and walked back to the skim car with the exact same rhythm in both legs, and the field coat moving in the wrong way at the back. The enforcers followed. The car lifted. It rose to about 40 meters, paused, and drifted east along the ridgeline. It did not leave the valley. It settled into the tree line about 600 meters up the ridge. It parked. Daniel did not stop smiling his homesteader smile until he was back inside the cabin and the door was bolted behind him and the carbine was in his hand. He went to the cellar hatch. He tapped it twice. Kaelith opened it from below, her small face in the lamplight, her amber eyes enormous. "We're leaving," he said. 10 minutes. She climbed out without a word. He packed by muscle memory. He was amazed at how fast the memory came back. Carbine spare cells, 4 of them, into the back pouch. Med kit, the compact one. Water bottles filled from the kitchen barrel. Rations, 3 days' worth of protein bars and 2 dehydrated meal packs. The chit, wrapped in cloth, inside his jacket. Blanket, a small flashlight. The folded knife, which he gave to Kaelith and which she put into the pocket of the tunic he had patched for her last night. He did not lock the cabin. A locked cabin would tell a warden something that a cabin with dirty dishes on the table would not, and he had left the dishes on the table for a reason. They went down the back slope into the thorn stand. The thorn stand was the one piece of this terrain a skim car could not follow them into. The vines grew thick and fibrous and ran head-high for half a kilometer. He had walked it once in his first month on Ashen Point because he had wanted to know how many ways there were out of his own valley. He had counted 3. This was the one with the worst footing and the best cover, and it was the one he took. Kaelith walked in front of him where he could see her. The slope was bad. Her bare feet were very good on the bad slope. She had no trouble. He had trouble because the prosthetic on his left calf did not love loose soil, and he compensated the way he had learned to compensate, which was to count his strides in groups of 100 and not to think about his leg. 3 hours down the slope, they came out of the thorn stand into the lower basin, and he let her drink from his bottle and let himself sit against a rock for 90 seconds and no more. The sun was past noon. He had a root in his head. He had not been to the Upper Slender Canyon in over a year, but he knew the rough line, and he had heard enough in the local trade posts to know that somewhere up those canyons where no skim car would go, the Verdani clans had put a village that most humans on this planet did not believe was real. He had believed it was real because he had listened to the way the old trapper in the trade post had not said its name, and he had known that not saying. By late afternoon, they were 3 kilometers south of the cabin. That was when he heard the whistle, high and metallic, 3 notes coming from downslope. He put his hand on Kaelith's shoulder, and she went still the way she had gone still in the clearing in the Slender. He scanned. He found them. A pack of 4 shrikes moving in a loose skirmish line through the underbrush, their heads low, their lenses sweeping. He pulled Kaelith into a hollow under a fallen ironwood. There was a space under the trunk a man and a child could just fit in if the man folded himself small. He folded himself small. He put Kaelith inside the arc of his body, and he put his hand over her mouth. Not hard, only a reminder. And he stopped breathing. He had expected her to breathe hard. She did not breathe at all. He felt her chest against his forearm, and the chest was not moving. Not slowly, not shallowly, not at all. He almost pulled his hand off her mouth out of alarm before he realized what she was doing. Her people could do this. They could stop. He had read a footnote in a xenobiology text once about Verdani juveniles being able to enter a kind of brief suspension, oxygen conserving, 3 to 4 minutes at a time. He had not known it was true. The Shrike pack passed 8 meters from the fallen ironwood. He could hear the micro-servos in their hips. He could hear the coolant tick. The pack moved through and then passed, and then was gone into the trees uphill. And it was only when the last of their sound had faded that Kaelith took a breath, long and slow, and turned her face against his sleeve. He did not speak for a full minute. Then he whispered, "Good girl, very good girl." And he felt her small shoulder shake once against his chest, and he realized she was laughing, quietly, into his arm. They moved again as soon as they could. He took her by the hand now because the ground was getting bad, and he was not going to let her out of reach. They climbed out of the basin on the south wall, and they followed a game trail he remembered up into the first of the lower canyons. Night came down cold. He found the hunter's lean-to he remembered from 2 winters ago, half collapsed but serviceable. He propped the fallen beam back up. He laid the blanket down. He gave her the bigger half of a ration bar and told her it was the smaller half, and she looked at him with her amber eyes while she chewed, and he knew she had known what he did and had let him do it anyway. She slept against his side. He did not. At first light, he woke her with a hand on her shoulder because something on the ridge above them had gone wrong. The birds had stopped. He pulled her upright and got the carbine up, and they moved out from under the lean-to into the gray first light. and they were 40 meters from it when the first shrike broke cover on the slope above them. He dropped it with his first shot. The second was closer than he had thought. It came out of the rocks on his right flank, and it was moving in the fast diagonal pattern they used when they had confirmed line of sight. He turned and fired, and he hit the thing in the shoulder plate, but the round did not go through cleanly. The drone kept coming. He put Kaelith against a tree behind him, and he backed up with the carbine at his shoulder, and he fired again and again, and the shrike was 6 meters away and still coming, and he was going to be 2 seconds short. Kaelith closed her eyes. She made a sound that was not language. It was low. It was low in a way a child's throat should not be able to go. It went through his rib cage. It went through the soles of his boots. It went into the soil under them. The tree behind her shuddered. A root under the leaf litter broke the surface with a crack, like a rifle shot, and caught the shrike's foreleg. The drone stumbled. A second root whipped up from the slope and took its hind leg. The thing thrashed in a cradle of moving wood, and Daniel stepped forward and put the muzzle of the carbine against the flat plate behind its false jaw and pulled the trigger. The drone went limp. The roots around it sank back into the soil like they had never been anywhere else. The tree was a tree again. Kaelith stood against the trunk with her eyes open and her nose bleeding and her skin gone gray-green at the cheeks. She took one step toward him and her knees stopped working. He caught her before she hit the ground. Her head came to rest under his chin, and her breath was very fast and very shallow, and her small 3-fingered hands were shaking the way her shoulders had shaken in the slender. Her nosebleed ran a clean violet line down her chin and onto the collar of her tunic. Her heartbeat under his palm was too quick. "All right," he said. "All right, I've got you. I've got you." He slung her onto his back with the field sling he had pulled out of the medkit the night before, because he had known somewhere under the part of him that made plans that he was going to need to carry her before this was over. He settled her. He took her small 3-fingered hands in his and folded them around the strap so that she would not fall if she lost consciousness, which she had. He started to run. He ran for most of the morning. He ran the way he had been taught to run when an asset on his back was becoming a casualty, which was long and smooth, and without thinking about anything except the next 30 meters of ground. He counted his strides in groups of 100. He breathed through his nose for the first 200 breaths and through his mouth for the next 200, and then he stopped counting breaths because his breathing was not going to be the thing that decided whether he got there. Kaelith's weight on his back stopped being weight and became a kind of tether he was attached to. By mid-morning, the second canyon narrowed into the third, which was the upper slender, a place he had never been. The rust-colored canopy thinned, and the rock walls rose and the air changed. It smelled different. It smelled of living wood and slow water and a faint green warmth he did not have a word for. He slowed because he was getting close to something, and he did not know what, and because he did not want to be a man running at a people he had never met with a green child on his back. He came around a bend in the canyon wall, and 2 Verdani women stepped out of the rock face and were in front of him before he saw them. They wore gray cloth wound tight around their limbs, and they were armed with something that looked like a bow and was not a bow. The wood of the weapon was still growing. He saw the small green tip of a leaf unfurling near the handhold of the nearer one. Both women had drawn and held. The nearer one had her arrow aimed at his sternum. The farther one had hers aimed at his left eye, which told him which one of them would make the decision if a decision had to be made. He stopped. He dropped to one knee slowly and he brought Kaelith around on her sling onto his chest so they could see her. "Please," he said. The nearer woman's arrow did not lower. The farther one's arrow did not lower either. They looked at Kaelith. Kaelith opened her eyes. She saw the women. She saw the arrows. She said 2 words in Verdani. Quiet, almost a whisper. The nearer woman's eyes widened. The farther one's arrow dropped 2 degrees and then all the way. The nearer woman turned her head slightly and made a small click with her tongue, and from somewhere behind the rock, a third Verdani, a very young one, broke from cover and ran back up the canyon, fast, silent, bare feet on the stone. The 2 women held their positions. "She's hurt," Daniel said. "She used her voice. Her nose is bleeding. I need a healer." The nearer woman said, "We heard her." Her standard was accented, soft, breath-shaped. She had a scar across the back of her left hand that was old enough to be a story. "You heard her," Daniel repeated. "In the stone. We hear a voice in the stone." She lowered her arrow the last of the way, and she beckoned with the backs of her fingers, and Daniel stood up with Kaelith in his arms, and he followed her deeper into the canyon. The doorway was a braided gap between two ironwood trunks. He would have walked past it 10 times on 10 different days and never seen it. The nearer woman turned sideways to pass through, and he did the same, and he came out the other side into a hollow that was not a hollow. A Verdani settlement lay in the cradle of the upper canyon. 40, maybe 50 people. Low longhouses of living woven wood. A central fire pit smoking gently against the noon. Children. A woman carrying a water skin stopped walking and put one hand on her mouth when she saw Kaelith. Somewhere a string instrument he did not recognize broke off mid-phrase. Every face in the hollow turned. An older Verdani woman rose from a low wooden seat near the fire pit. She was tall and slow, and her hair was not white. Her hair was silver, a pale, clean metal color that he would learn later meant something specific and heavy. She crossed the hollow with a long, unhurried step. She stopped 2 paces from Daniel, and she looked at Kaelith in his arms, and the look was a kind of reading. Then she looked at Daniel, and her look changed, and she said, in standard that was better than the centuries, "You have carried a very heavy thing a very long way." He did not know what to say to that. She took Kaelith out of his arms with a gentleness he did not expect. 2 younger Verdani women closed in around her, and they carried Kaelith off to one of the longhouses. And Daniel stood in the hollow with his hands empty and did not know what to do with them. The silver-haired woman introduced herself as Sarah. She brought him a cup of warm water with something floral in it, and she sat him down beside the fire pit on a flat stone, and she waited until he had drunk before she spoke. "Her mother was trying to reach us," Sarah said. "I guessed. She would not have made it even if the compact had not found her. The route she was on was 3 days through ground, the compact patrols at night. She chose to stop in your basin because she thought she had more time." "She didn't. She did not." Daniel drank the rest of the cup. It tasted of something like mint and something like rain. "What is she?" he said. "What is Kaelith?" Sarah looked at the fire. "She is a verdant voice," she said. "In our old tongue, the word is much older than we are. A voice is a child who is raised in resonance with a living world, so that when she grows, the world and her people can speak to one another, and the world will defend its people, and the people will tend the world. A voice is the covenant a Verdani clan makes when it settles a home. It is not a weapon, it is a promise. She was meant to inherit that covenant for a place the compact broke before she was born. Her mother was carrying her to a host world that would accept her adoption. Your basin was a waypoint. It was not the home." Daniel held the empty cup in his hands. "How long would it have taken," he said, "for her to inherit?" 8 years. He sat with that number. He thought about 8 years in this canyon. He thought about 8 years of his own life, which had not been going anywhere in particular. And he thought about the shape those 8 years would have, and he found that the shape did not frighten him. The shape felt, if anything, like a door he had been standing next to without knowing it was a door. "Can you protect her?" he said. Sarah's eyes came up and they were very clear. "No," she said. "We can shelter her. We cannot protect her. The compact has been thinning these canyons for 9 years. Our weapons grow, Daniel Reyes. They do not keep up. What we need is time. Time is what a voice needs. Time is what we do not have." He nodded slowly. "How much time does the compact need," he said, "to find this place?" Sarah was about to answer when the horn sounded. It was an old horn carved from the curled shell of something Daniel did not recognize. And the note it made was one he did not expect to hear twice in his life. A sentry came running down the path from the upper lip of the canyon, breathless, barefoot, a young Verdani man whose eyes were too wide. "Gunships," he said in standard, for Daniel's sake. 3. Mouth of the canyon. They have seen the village." Osira rose. She stood for a moment looking at the smoke of her fire. Then she looked at Daniel, and the look was steady and old and without fear, and she said, "Time has run out before it started. Tell me, soldier, what does a human soldier know about buying minutes?" "Everything," he said, "and nothing." He was already on his feet. He set his line at the canyon neck, where the walls came in narrow and the ground rose in a low spine of rock that forced any landing craft to slow and any ground force to funnel. 6 Verdani archers went with him. A clan hunter named Vel carried a shoulder-fired launcher, shaped like a knotted branch that Daniel had no reference for. And 7th in the line, because Osera had insisted, and because Kaelith, waking and still pale, had insisted too, stood the child herself on the flat stone at the top of the rise, with the silver-haired elder at her shoulder. The canyon, Osera had said, will listen better to a voice standing on its stone. The first gunship came in low and fast. Daniel watched it through the sight of the carbine and counted the heartbeats of its approach. He raised his left hand. Vel sighted the launcher and fired when Daniel dropped his hand. The grown wood shell left the weapon with a sound like a quick exhale. It struck the near engine of the gunship, and the engine stopped being an engine. The ship yawed hard, caught the rock wall with its left wing, and pancaked into the canyon floor in a long dying skid. The sound of it reached them a half-second after the impact. The second and third gunships deployed before they set down. Enforcers rappelled in. Daniel counted 12 and stopped counting at 12 because 2 wardens came down on a separate line, and that was what mattered. Shrikes came off the ramps of the gunships in long jumping strides, 8 at least, maybe more. The fight was what the fight always was. It was loud. It was short. It was the thing he had said he would never do again, and the thing he had known in the bottom of his body that he would do again the moment a small green child had put her hand on the back of his wrist. He worked his lane. He took 2 enforcers in the first 10 seconds and a shrike in the next 5. The Verdani archers worked theirs, and their grown arrows hit synthetic targets and did things to those targets Daniel had not expected. The paralytic held. A shrike that took an arrow in the neck plate went stiff in mid-stride and fell over sideways. A second warden raised his staff toward Daniel's position and spat a white line of energy at him, and the line would have taken him in the chest except that Vel's second launcher round came in from above and angled the warden's arm, and the line went high and cut a furrow of black glass into the rock over Daniel's left shoulder. A shrike broke the line. It was moving in that long diagonal he had seen before. Fast, clean, line of sight. It was going for Kaelith. He swung the carbine, but the swing was too slow. He saw it in the slow way bad things got seen. Her small figure on the flat stone, the drone closing the last 15 meters, her hand coming up. She opened her mouth. She did not scream. She sang. The note she made was low, and it was impossibly deep for her body, and it went into the stone she was standing on, and the stone answered. Every root in the walls of the canyon leaned toward her. The leaves of the ironwood trees turned, together, all of them, as if a wind had come through that did not exist. The shrike 10 meters from her stopped running because the ground under its feet stopped being ground. Vines came up like hands. A cable of thornwood the thickness of a man's thigh lifted the remaining warden off his feet and closed around him and did not open again. The last standing gunship, trying to lift off for a second pass, did not lift. Its skids were held by a living vine that had not been there 15 seconds ago. The pilot gave the engine everything it had. The vine did not care. It pulled the ship back down into the soil as calmly as a man setting a book back on a shelf. The sound of the canyon stopped. Kaelith stood very still on the flat stone. Her mouth closed. Her eyes opened. Her small 3-fingered hand came down slowly to her side. The canyon held its breath. Daniel crossed the distance to her at a run that felt like wading through water. She was swaying by the time he got there. Her nose was bleeding again, and the violet ran down her chin and onto the front of her tunic, and she looked up at him as he knelt in front of her, and she smiled, tired, proud, and she said a Verdani word, and this time he understood it without being told. She had said home. He caught her as her knees went. The clan came to the canyon neck in a slow, quiet wave. Osera came first, and she did not look at the wreckage around her, and she did not look at the wardens pinned in thorn. She looked at Daniel, who was sitting on the flat stone with Kaelith across his lap, and she knelt beside him, and she took a silver cord from inside her sleeve. A cord braided so fine Daniel almost could not see the braid. and she tied it gently around his left wrist in a knot he did not know the name of. "This is an Irimara," she said. "It cannot be cut by the one who wears it, only by the one who gave it, or by the child the wearer guarded." Daniel did not answer in words. He looked at his wrist. The cord sat against the reed bracelet Kaelith had never taken off, and the two touched, mother's red and elder's silver, and something in his chest moved that he had thought would not move again. That night the sanctuary was quiet. The clan had pulled the bodies, what there was of them, out to the canyon mouth, and the thorn had settled, and the living vines had gone back to being walls, and the canyon itself, Osera had said, had remembered Kaelith now. The compact would not find this place again the way it had found it today. The canyon would move around any new hunters the way a sleeper turns away from a hand. Daniel sat by the fire pit with Kaelith asleep against his chest. Osera sat across from him on the low wooden seat. She was looking into the fire, and after a long time without looking up, she said, "You have 8 years." He did not answer. "Stay," she said, "if you wish." He looked down at the child in his arms. He brushed a braid out of her face with the back of his knuckle, the way he had used to do for a sister he did not talk about, the way he had thought he had forgotten how to do. Her breath was warm against his collarbone. The reed bracelet on her wrist, the one her mother had tied there, touched the silver cord on his. He did not answer Osera in words. He did not need to. He sat by the fire with the small green child asleep against him, and the shadow that had once fallen across her had become a shape she slept inside of, and the sound he listened for was his own breath and hers together, steady, and he stopped counting.